Thank you for joining us today. My name is Britt Grossman. I lead the Climate Smart Ag Group here at EDF. Very excited today for a couple of reasons. One thing is we are launching a new report prepared for us by ICF called Ambitious Climate Mitigation Pathways for U.S. Agriculture and Forestry Vision for 2030. So it's really looking at what can we really do within those sectors by 2030, what is scientifically, economically viable. I'm very excited about that. Amy Hughes, who has been leading this work from EDF, will be leading a panel discussion on that in a little while. Before that, though, so we have a real treat for you. We have Bill Hohenstein, Director of Office of Energy and Environmental Policy of USDA. He leads in that portfolio. It's a very small portfolio. It includes climate policy, environmental markets, and energy policy. So you can see that he is really the right person to be here to give some introductory remarks for this. Bill's been working on climate issues since 1992, he told me earlier. Yes. For his sins, for a long time. And obviously, there's a lot of exciting stuff happening in the past couple of months from the US government on incentives for, climate mitigation. So we're very excited about that. Thank you so much for joining us, Bill. Over to you.
It's my pleasure, and thank you, Britt. And again, it's a real pleasure to be here up in New York to talk about the exciting things that are going on within USDA. I've been the director of our climate change program for 22 years, and I've got to say that these last few months have been as exciting and as daunting as any that I've experienced in my time at USDA. So, and it's a great time to be here at EDF, up here for Climate Week in New York, and to share with you a little bit about what we're doing and hopefully answer some of your questions. So, lot to talk about. So let's go ahead and get started. So let me start by covering our broader climate strategy. And so the announcements that you're hearing about, the climate change partnership effort, the work under the Inflation Reduction Act, really provide a tremendous amount of resources, but are part of our broader climate strategy. And this is driven right from the top. As all of you are well aware at this point, climate change is one of the administration's top priorities. It's one of Secretary Vilsack's top priorities. We have rejoined the Paris Agreement, and with that comes a lot of responsibilities. And so we've created a very ambitious climate goal to reduce emissions by 50 to 52% in a decade. And we have 8 years, so the clock is ticking. A lot of work to do there, but that's just the first step, really, to reach net greenhouse gas neutrality by 2050. And so the effort and the resources we have under these two major initiatives are going to play a significant role in the sector's ability to meet these challenges. So just a word or two about our broader effort. And so we actually have 10 climate priorities within the department. The first is focusing on mitigation and climate smart agriculture, both through existing programs and now expanding on them with funds that we're getting from the IRA, and to establish a new partnership initiative, which is now launched. We also are doing work on climate smart forestry, more complex, because there we're concerned not just with sequestering carbon, but maintaining forest health and maintaining the stocks of carbon in a way that's ecologically sound. As part of our efforts, we're really pressing to improve performance when it comes to quantification of metrics. In all of what we're doing, we're also thinking about the fact that climate change is happening. We're seeing it on the ground. The sectors that we're concerned about and the communities that we're concerned with are feeling those effects. So we have a robust adaptation and resilience strategy that we announced last year, and now we have 15 agency-specific adaptation strategies. And all of those plans are really designed to ensure that we consider climate change as we carry out our mission, which is to support agriculture, forestry, and rural communities. To do that and to be effective, it's going to take more than my little office. We have a staff of 13. We're very busy. It's great. But we know that ultimately, if we're going to be effective, we'll need a climate-informed workforce. And so part of our effort is actually training staff in the field about how climate change affects their work, how they can be a part of the efforts that we're launching. We continue to focus on research and development. I think in the session this morning, it was pretty clear that information is important. A lot of remaining questions, especially around technology and innovation in the space of fertilizers, feed additives. So a lot of work to do there. Many folks don't fully realize that USDA is not just agriculture. We certainly have the Forest Service, but we also have an entire mission area focused on rural development. And a lot of that is focused on providing services to rural communities, especially energy services. And so we do have a pretty significant footprint and capability to work on energy efficiency, renewable energy generation, and how that links to rural America. In everything we do, equity and environmental justice is going to be critical. That's another priority that we are hearing from the top, and it's something that within USDA we've probably ignored for too long. And so there, and you'll see in the partnership initiative that it's a priority, and it's not just talk. We want to see action, and we're going to be focused on it not just today, but moving forward. And then the final element of our strategy, the 10th of our priorities, is that the U.S. is not an island. To do this work, we're going to need to also share what we're doing internationally and to really be an active voice in the international dialogue. So that's what's keeping me awake and keeping us busy. It's a pretty broad portfolio, but each element is really critical. And doing this, we need to be comprehensive. We focus on voluntary incentive-based solutions just because we know that works with farmers and producers. But working in equity, accessibility, and building partnerships with the private sector. So let me talk a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act. Funny name, obviously there's a big climate component to it. USDA is going to receive almost $40 billion of investment over the next 5 years, spread across 3 main areas: conservation, forestry, and rural development and energy. The conservation provisions will function because of the nature of the Inflation Reduction Act. We're basically talking about expanding existing programs. And so the $19 billion will be invested through programs like EQIP, the Conservation Security Program, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and ACIP. It's a lot of resources to work with, a lot of investments. Congress has been very specific that in making these investments, we need to ensure that these resources are used to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or sequester carbon. So we're not talking broadly about conservation. We're talking much more narrowly about the specific technologies and practices that can either store carbon, reduce methane and nitrous oxide emissions, or generate reduce carbon renewable energy. Forest Service will be expanding their work on forest health. There was a comparable amount of funding under the infrastructure bill, so there's about $5 billion there. Another $5 billion under the Inflation Reduction Act. So those resources are being managed sort of as a larger pool. It will help reduce wildfire risk on national forest lands, improve forest resilience, restore forests through tree planting, work with the private sector through easements and reforestation programs. So it will give the Forest Service a pretty big footprint when it comes to improving forest health, restoring forests, and really making these forests more resilient in the face of climate change, which is going to be critical. And I'll get to sort of why that's so critical. Forests are a significant carbon sink in the US. They currently offset about 13 to 15% of our total emissions each year. Maintaining and enhancing that sink is really critical to overall success, but also securing those stocks so these forests don't in the future become a source of emissions is also quite important. Again, folks don't always realize that rural development is part of USDA. We work, and there's 3 programs here that are funded under the IRA. The first will support a program called REAP, which provides loans and grants to install renewable energy and energy efficiency projects in rural communities and on farm. Part of the funds will go to a program called HBIP, which is expanding biofuel infrastructure, basically helping retailers offer higher blends of ethanol and biodiesel and renewable diesel and helping build out that infrastructure. And then the final piece will work with the rural cooperatives. If you live in a rural community, your electricity is probably provided by a rural cooperative, an electric cooperative. Historically, these co-ops have relied heavily on fossil fuels, in particular coal, to generate electricity. These resources will help them transition to a green energy and low carbon future. So that's a lot. We're in the early stages. I think our office will be working with each of these agencies, NRCS when it comes to conservation programs, Forest Service when it comes to forestry programs and rural development, helping to ensure that we have metrics of success. We want to see not only actions on the ground, but we want to be able to quantify the benefits, ensure that they're reflected in our national accounts, so they ultimately end up in what we report under the Paris Agreement. We also want to make sure those funds are invested wisely and efficiently. And so our office has done a lot of analysis on where these greenhouse gas benefits are within the farm and the forest sector, and how to effectively advance renewable energy and through programs like REAP. So we're going to be busy. That's only one thing. Let me talk a little bit about the partnership initiative, because that's getting a lot of buzz. In fact, I'm getting a lot of questions about it in the hall. Secretary Vilsack, I think it was just last week, these weeks are blurring together, announced the first tranche of grants under the program, $2.8 billion in grants. I gotta say, it's exciting. When we came up with this idea and took it to the secretary, he was very excited about it. But there was also this question of like Field of Dreams. If you build it, will they come, right? And so I was confident. And so when we launched the request for proposals, we didn't know quite what to expect. The secretary really pressed and said, we're going to offer $1 billion in grants, which was a huge amount of money. And we got $20 billion in proposals with, I think, almost $8 to $9 billion in private sector match. It's huge. And really high quality proposals across the board. And in response to that, the secretary said, okay, we're going to push for more. And in fact, we announced $2.8 billion in grants just in the larger pool. We'll be announcing a second pool of awardees later in the fall that will be smaller grants that are going to be targeting minority institutions, equity, and innovation. And so we're not quite done yet. We've got more to do. A little bit about the concept, because the concept of this program is really important. It's a commodity program. It's being financed through the Commodity Credit Corporation, and we are required to ensure that we are establishing or creating new market opportunities for producers and new markets for commodities. And the way we're doing this is we're branding these commodities. We're ensuring that farmers that are generating a commodity, whether it be corn or soybeans or beef or milk or eggs, that are doing it in a way that has greenhouse gas benefits, can embed those greenhouse gas benefits in the commodity itself. So you think about organics, and I know folks within the department say, well, this is different than organics, and it is. But conceptually, there are some similarities where consumers are willing to pay a premium because they know that the product, how the product is produced, has benefits, right? And so when they're looking at an apple, a conventional apple and an organic apple, they may look the same, but they know that the organic apple has a production process which is different. That's essentially what we're doing here. We're essentially looking at the commodities that are produced, not just the commodity, but the production system, and valuing production systems that have low carbon or low greenhouse gas attributes. So again, $2.8 billion, 70 large projects. Within the awardees, we received over a 50% match. You know, and it was just a small subset of the much larger pool of proposals we had. So there were a lot of really good proposals that did not get funded, and that was, you know, that's always difficult, but it's sort of an indication of the interest that's out there. Through these programs, we expect to reach 50,000 farms, 20 to 25 million acres, and just directly through the direct benefits of these projects over the time period, we expect to be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by over 50 million tons. And in my view, that's a little bit conservative, not counting the indirect effects, not counting the spillover effects, and not counting the long-term effects. And so it's a big deal. 50 institutions, including minority institutions, and each project has a number of components which will be critical to us. Providing direct incentives, both technical and financial, to the producers to enable them to employ these practices. Strong measurement, monitoring, verification systems. So evaluating the systems to ensure that when we quantify these greenhouse gas benefits, the public has confidence in those numbers. Equity, making sure that we're being inclusive in each of these projects, and each project has an equity component and an outreach component to make sure that we're including all the communities and all the farmers that are out there that have the potential to participate. And then marketing, following this through to create products that are branded or labeled or valued because of their greenhouse gas attributes. And that could include consumer products, but it could include things that you might not think about, like a biofuel that has a lower carbon intensity score. Right now, California and the states are actually valuing that. And so is there a way of connecting that back to the farming practices and valuing farming practices that have better greenhouse gas attributes in terms of producing the feedstocks that end up in the fuels that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions? So our office is going to have a role in this. We're not implementing the program, we're not running the program, but we will be helping to evaluate the program. And so our little office is working with the farm mission area, FPAC, to stand up a partnership network. And this is a really critical part of the entire enterprise. These, you know, we're calling these projects pilots. I know that sounds $2.8 billion of pilots, but the reason why we're calling these pilots is we don't have all the answers now. There's plenty we need to learn from this process. And that's an important component to this as well. And so the partnership network will allow us to collect data and information from each of these projects to evaluate each element of the project, whether it be, you know, how well is financial and technical assistance going? What are some of the models for expanding that? Because that's been a constraint within our programs. How are we measuring, monitoring, and verifying these benefits? Are there more cost-effective ways of doing it? Are there ways of reducing uncertainty? Do folks have confidence in those numbers? How well are we doing the outreach to underserved communities? And how can we do that better? What are some of the models that are working effectively? And then finally, you know, how are we doing in marketing? And is the public willing to pay, you know, the few cents more, the dime, or, you know, 20 cents more for a good or a service that has climate benefits? And are those benefits working their way back to the farmer? So the farmer sees an opportunity to change behavior, and can we, you know, build on that? So we're really excited about this effort. You know, happy to talk about it because it's a new concept. It's a new concept for USDA. We're sort of breaking a lot of sort of historic ways that we've done things. Certainly in terms of the extent we're working with private sector partners and NGOs and universities. But it's also going to be new for the producers as well. This is a new model for them. I don't know how much time we have. How are we doing? Okay. I heard folks wanted to talk about methane today. So I'm happy to talk about methane. Just to say though, methane is not the whole story. It's an important greenhouse gas. Definitely recognize that. Agriculture is an important source of methane emissions. We're also a major source of nitrous oxide emissions, and we have a lot of opportunities to sequester and reduce carbon. But in particular, we have three major sources of methane in the U.S. from agriculture: enteric fermentation, which I think they talked a little bit about this morning, manure management systems, and rice cultivation. The partnership initiative has some very large rice projects that are going to be, really testing on the ground in a significant way the practices that we know have benefits in reducing methane emissions from rice. We're very bullish on our opportunities to address methane from manure management, and we're seeing rapid transformation in dairy and swine operations, driven in many ways by this demand for renewable natural gas. So, the key to reducing methane from manure management is to move rapidly away from anaerobic lagoons, open lagoons that are basically functioning to basically generate a significant amount of methane, a large amount of methane per animal. Almost any other manure management system is better. But in particular, if we can convert these where we actually can capture the methane and utilize it, there's a lot of opportunity there. As we do this, we're going to need to listen. A lot of stakeholders are nervous about this approach. Are we going to be, just underwriting and supporting large animal operations if we do this? Our local community is going to be affected, and how? And so we certainly have questions we need to be addressing and answering. Again, we're going to be working on some of these technologies through the partnership initiative. But certainly that's part of our overall strategy, is to ensure that as we're moving forward with transitioning farmers away from anaerobic lagoons, and especially toward things like anaerobic digesters and systems that capture methane, that we're taking local community concerns into account. Why don't I stop there? I know folks have questions because I've already heard a lot. So Britt, let me turn things back to you.
Thank you so much, Bill. Yes, I think we could probably talk next 3 hours. Don't have time for that, very packed schedule.
Sure.
But I will take 1 or 2 questions from the audience. The mics are up here, so if you stand up, speak loud, I will probably just repeat your question so the people watching us online can also hear it. You have a question for Bill?
Everyone's shy all of a sudden. Oh, there we go.
Wendy.
So I'm just curious how you're tracking the data for these multiple, let's just take one. How do you actually track the data and then see the growth, and how long are you trying to get it? Something that I constantly work with, as a private family foundation, how do we track data? You're doing it on a much bigger scale, so curious now.
So do you mean tracking the data of the impact of the investments?
Correct.
So how do you track data, Bill?
Yeah.
It's a whole issue.
No, it's not insignificant. So we actually are setting up a climate dashboard within USDA that is focused on our existing program. So if you think of a program like the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, it operates in every state, boiling it down to individual contracts with individual growers that are employing specific technologies. So, that data system tracks that. We can convert those benefits into the greenhouse gas benefits and then sum them up. So that is the system that we intend to expand on when it comes to IRA implementation. So as we're investing through the Inflation Reduction Act, we have the system in place to monitor what contracts are being awarded, what farmers are involved. The partnership initiative is going to be a different beast. Each partner is going to have their own set of partner and set of growers they're working with and data systems. We are setting up agreements with each of the awardees that will have a data sharing component. How that works out is still in progress. Certainly, we need to be cognizant of what we call PII, which is personally identifiable information. As the federal government, we protect that information very carefully. And so as we set up these systems, there are ways of aggregating that data where we can actually distribute it and make it more publicly available. But we are also very aware that when farmers are sharing their information with a partner or with us, that they expect it to be treated confidentially.
Thank you, Bill. So one more question, yes?
I wanted to ask, when you had this much funding requested coming in, how did your selection process work for now?
Okay, so 20 billion requests. How did you wind that down and choose?
I think she's asking about the partnership initiative, right?
No, actually, it was
Yeah.
Oh, about the 20.
There was 20 billion
Oh, right,
requests,
right,
and you
right,
had to wind it down to 1 billion, and then luckily you found 1.8 billion in the sofa. But
I don't know about the sofa. Pretty big sofa. It was rigorous. It was analytic and quantitative. The criteria were spelled out in the RFP. And so when we issued the request for proposals, we said successful projects need to address these criteria. They need to have a well-defined strategy for providing technical and financial assistance to farmers. They need a detailed measurement, monitoring, and verification plan, need a plan for outreach to underserved farmers and communities, and we need to have a marketing strategy. Recognizing that almost no single entity can do all of that. The successful projects tended to be consortiums where they brought together different groups that could serve different parts. There was a lot of creativity that we saw in the successful proposals. I can't talk specifics about sort of what that process looked like, who was involved, ultimately how the projects were awarded. I can say it was a very difficult process because there were a tremendous number of really strong proposals.
okay, well, thank you again. So please join me. Invite Amy and her esteemed panel to please come forward.
Take the stage for a moment if you don't mind. Thank you, Bill.
Sure.
Yeah.
Where do you want me?
Wherever you can take my seat. Thanks, Brett. Thank you, Bill. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to bring up our panel and get that discussion going. But first, I just want to set a little bit of context and give you some kind of behind the scenes information for the impetus of bringing this group together that we're going to talk with. So just this morning, EDF launched a new report with economic analysis from ICF, a leading analytical firm in this space that supports Bill's work over the years as well, to set the first ever science-based emission reduction target specifically for U.S. agriculture and forestry by 2030. And as Bill mentioned, the Biden-Harris administration has set a net zero target for 2050 for the economy, reducing emissions in half by 2030. And when we think about agriculture's role of about 10% of those emissions, we really wanted to know what's ambitious, what would be achievable and feasible for agriculture and forestry and related land use change to contribute to those reductions. And we found that it wasn't very clear, especially in terms of what would it cost and what's the relative cost effectiveness of the different mitigation pathways. Until now, because we launched the report this morning, and I encourage you to dig into it. There's a lot of really meaty analysis if you want to dig in by certain subsectors or specifically by gas. But just to give you a couple of high-level takeaways, what we're talking about, what we found, is that it is feasible to reduce annual emissions by 560 million metric tons a year across this system of subsectors. So to give you an idea, that's taking 120 million gasoline-powered vehicles off the road every year. roughly half of registered vehicles in the US every year. And what's great about this is there's 9 pathways, each of which have multiple practices and technologies at varying stages of research and development and implementation readiness. But given all of that, we still arrived at this number of 560 million metric tons, hence the name of this session, how to reduce them by 500 million by 2030. And just to give you an idea, so we used the 2018 baseline from EPA data. That represents for agriculture specifically a 23% reduction. And for forestry, that would be increasing removal potential by 43%. So these are significant ramping up opportunities for contributions to the country's emission reduction goals. And these efforts to achieve these targets can benefit producers and landowners, local and downstream communities, as well as the economy overall. So some of the equity and environmental justice topics that Bill mentioned, we're definitely going to get into on the panel as well. And just quickly on the economic side, we also want to try to understand the cost effectiveness of these practices. So if we have large sums of money becoming available, where do we direct those to get the most impact and know that we're going to get permanent trackable reductions? And the sweet spot that we found, thanks to ICS analysis, was about $27 per metric ton of carbon dioxide. So whether you're thinking about government investment, the voluntary carbon market, corporate Scope 3 investment, we found that at about that price point, that bottom-up target becomes achievable. And as more investment comes online, we go over the 560 mark. So that starts to give us an idea of what ballpark we're talking about for the investment. And at a high level, what we found performance-wise was that forestry and avoided land use conversion delivered the most bang for the buck for these pathways. So at any price point of carbon dioxide, they delivered the most. But obviously, we need to keep producing food, and there's an emission reduction, there's an emission footprint associated with doing so. And looking specifically at agriculture, we found that agroforestry, so introducing trees onto cropland and grazing systems, nutrient management on cropland, and improved manure management were the top performers in terms of bang for your buck. It's important to note, as Bill said, that agriculture also has outsized contributions of nitric oxide and methane. So when we start to multiply those greenhouse gas emissions, their impact by their warming potential, they have an even larger role to play, especially methane in the short term, given its shorter lifespan in the atmosphere and greater warming potential. And as projects are developed, especially for manure management to capture methane, we also need to make sure that we're taking into account the local community impact. So as the climate-focused projects are developed, the local communities need to be engaged in those discussions, and their needs need to be addressed so that it's a holistic, inclusive solution. So now that we've talked about the broader context and some high-level results, we're going to transition into our panel, which we will be bearing in mind that while we arrived at these high-level numbers and some takeaways to give us an idea, the solutions themselves will need to be tailored for implementation at the local level, taking into account the local needs and the socioeconomic profiles and conditions of the producers and the landowners. And that's going to take a concerted effort by government, industry, civil society, corporations, anyone who's looking at how to reduce these emissions across all stakeholders. This is a new resource that we're really excited to contribute to those efforts. So with that, we are going to hear from these leading experts who are doing this work now about what it's going to take to achieve these science-based targets and how they're approaching this and what they're finding. So I invite you all to join me for some Q&A. I am going to set No, y'all can take it. Yeah, I'll just mess with the tape.
How you doing?
Good to see you. I know you work on all the tops and
That's right. I'll go on the other side.
I don't really need to sit in the middle.
Thank
I'll put you there.
Yeah, yeah.
I will move that, yeah. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and being here. So I will quickly introduce folks, starting from this end. We have Craig Hansen, Managing Director of Programs for World Resources Institute. Steele Lorenz, Head of Sustainable Business for Farmers Business Network. Rita Height, CEO and President of American Forest Foundation. Freddie Davis, III, Director of Rural Training and Research Center for the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. Melissa Ho, Senior Vice President, Freshwater and Food with World Wildlife Fund US. And Kirsten Jaglow, Expert Consultant on Climate Change and Sustainability with ICF, who was integral to the report and can help us speak to that on the panel. Okay. So Rita, I'm going to start with you because I have intel that you sat by a colleague on the train and read the report.
That's a small world, I have to say. It's amazing.
So I know that you've read it. So just to kind of start high level, if you could talk about what was a takeaway or something that surprised you from taking in the information from the report.
Yeah, thank you. And it was a pleasure to sit next to your colleague on the train. My colleague and I were geeking out about aspen forests, and I think she overheard that conversation. She's like, "Hey, cool." So yes, this is what we talk about on the train. So in terms of the takeaways, I think the thing that we're seeing, and you mentioned this in terms of the forestry opportunity, right? The American Forest Foundation, we're a conservation organization that focuses on family forests and helping unlock the potential of family forests to mitigate climate change. And one of the things that you named is the big opportunities in forests are improved forest management and reforestation, as well as avoided wildfire emissions. Bill spoke a little bit to that as well. I think the report kind of reaffirms what we're seeing and hearing on the ground in terms of the opportunities around those critical forest areas. I think the other thing that it reinforces for us is when you look at the data and kind of unpack, where are the opportunities for improved forest management? Where are the opportunities for reforestation and avoided wildfire emissions? Yes, a lot of our forest issues have been around public lands, and the conversations have been around public lands. The big opportunities for mitigation on those fronts is actually in the private lands. And even more so when you look at that land base, more than 40% of that land base is small family owners, right? Average acreage size somewhere in the 80 to 100 acre range. So we've got to figure out solutions to work with that population of landowners out there, tearing off of the big opportunities around improved forest management, reforestation, and avoided wildfire emissions. So those are a couple of my takeaways. I can geek out further, and we spent 2 hours doing that, but happy to go wherever you want.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. And Freddie, I think that's a nice segue to something we were talking about last night. So thinking about what you're working with small family forest landowners and ranchers, the Federation. Can you talk about what are you seeing as far as, I think I asked, what are the economic opportunities? So if you're thinking about land retention and keeping these folks on their land across these livestock and forest opportunities, what stands out to you in terms of what it would take and how to help them do that?
I think it's around sustainability, and sustainability could have a lot of different meanings. But when we start talking from our perspective, is sustainability as in land retention. Again, that's making it flow financially, and so it's the markets and access to markets for those landowners. And what we're seeing is a diverse group of landowners and diverse operations, which include cow-calf operations as well as timber. And it's about managing both of them sustainably in some type of a system that's intentional. So those are some of the things that we're assisting landowners with, is that planning aspect and putting a plan with it to where you can manage both the cow-calf operation as well as the timber sustainably. And then it's advocating for those landowners to make sure that as we sit at the table and develop policies, that there's a people aspect to it that needs to be considered. Rita mentioned the average landowner size is 80 to 100 acres. The landowners that we're representing, most of the underserved landowners in the South, that average is about 30 acres. So making sure that these policies are scalable. We mentioned in the report, it was mentioned about avoided conversion. And so we start talking about carbon credits and looking at how those are evaluated and additionality. And we look at that whole aspect. And additionality is kind of, okay, what's the chance that this is going to be harvested? And on a lot of our landowners, the chance is very slim. So the value of their carbon, the carbon credits on that property is low. And so there's that takes that financial incentive away. But do we consider the avoided convergence, change, land use change? And so it's taking those considerations and all of that, which is something that's very seldom considered, and making it more real on a smaller scale.
That makes a lot of sense. I want to zoom out a little bit. You mentioned land use change, and Craig, I know at WRI you're aiming to direct your programs and centers toward a net zero pathway. And I saw that you'd worked on agriculture and land use change type initiatives, and wonder, how is WRI approaching avoided land use conversion? I know we talked about methane earlier too.
Yeah, so thank you for the invitation, and congratulations on the report. I know how hard those things can be, and I'm sure you got pretty close, and almost in the last 20% took 80% of the time, right? It passed as prologue on these types of things. So, and congratulations to Bill and the U.S. government for all the great stuff. I mean, what a windfall, right? I mean, let's take it and run with it and have impact, right? I mean, it's great. The elections matter, right? And so, and there's a big election on the planet on land use change coming next week in the great nation of Brazil. That might have huge implications on the future of land use and climate on the planet. I consider that probably the most important election in the world this year, with U.S. congressional elections as number 2 in terms of the issues that we care about. So yes, WRI, as part of our vision, is we want to help the world get to the just transition to a net zero world by the year 2050. And part of my job is to help wrangle all the programs, climate, energy, cities, you name it, food, land, water, energy, oceans, in that direction. And on the food and land and water type of dimensions of work, it's a big deal. It's super important. I mean, Bill was talking about it. We don't get to where we need to be as a nation or as a world unless we figure out that the food, agriculture, and forest system has to play a major role in getting there. In fact, it has to become net negative to help compensate for some of the residual emissions we're going to have from the energy system by the year 2050. When it comes to that, our kind of mantra is produce, protect, reduce, restore. We need to be able to produce the food and fiber that the world needs by the year 2050. And I think a lot of us forget about that we still need to feed a growing planet. We need to fiber a growing planet. We like to focus on the protect and the restore. But I think there's a big element missing on the produce side. So the farmers, the lumbermen, et cetera, of the planet fundamentally are super important. We can't forget that, right? And so, but the question is, how do we produce that food and fiber in a manner that actually is low carbon, has as minimal impact on the land and ecosystem as possible, right? So we do need, how do you sustainably boost yields, right, so to speak? We need to actually protect the nature that remains. And we're big into protecting forests. We all need and know that. There's also a lot of grassland. The grasslands actually on the planet are actually the most converted over the past 8,000 years. Also wetlands of the planet, right? And so it's we can't just save the forests and then basically shift and get rid of the rest of the world's grasslands, right? So we look at all ecosystems are important. The protect agenda. We also need to reduce the pressure that humans have. The energy system went through a big push on improving efficiencies triggered by the oil crisis in the 70s. I'd say the ag system yet hasn't had that experience. Given the fact that food loss and waste is around 30% of all the food that's grown on the planet, right, ends up being lost or wasted from the farm on the floor. That to me is a huge inefficiency in the system. Right? Think of all the land, the labor, the water, the fertilizer, et cetera, that was, inputs to that ends up not making it to a human stomach. And then finally, we need to restore some of what's been lost. And I noticed in Bill's point about restoring some of the forests that have been lost due to the recent wildfires, but also restoring some other areas as well. It's that whole package. I think a lot of us in our community focus on one thing. We're really good at the protect side, right? Or really good at the restore side. But I think the full approach has to be all four. I think politically you don't get there unless there's a strong produce side, because politicians don't get elected on just protect. They get elected on produce and the jobs and the food security that agenda provides. But it needs to be together. If you do one on its own, then actually you create these trade-offs. And so looking at it holistically, I think, is super important.
Thank you for that overview. Bill, I want to come back to you in a second about the sustainable intensification. But first, Melissa, I know we can't really see each other. How is WWF? I was thinking about the corporate stakeholders and trying to engage the food production side. How are you all thinking about moving on these multiple pathways and getting them engaged to take action here?
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much for convening us. And really also, I wanted to add congratulations on a fantastic report, really timely, especially with the grants and the work underway on climate smart commodities. So I really want to just pull on the framing that Craig and WRI has provided, because we align really, really closely with that overall approach, as well as really thinking about the systems lens. And I think the pieces that I'll maybe add a little more insight is what that looks like and some of the trade-off implications when you don't think about it all together. So we partner in, and two of the points that I'd say really stuck out with me about your report was pulling this thread on land use change and also livestock. Those are two really key things to think about. And then the intersection of livestock on land use change, for instance. So there's this idea that we need to improve efficiencies and practices, which is true, but we need to think about some existential issues about what drives land use change. And so right now, conversion of grasslands, I really appreciate that point. It's a huge issue. We think about conversion in the Amazon. Grasslands in South America is also really an important point. I think what Craig was trying to elucidate is that production of soy and beef is moving out of the Amazon because everyone's focused on the Amazon and moved to neighboring grassland ecosystems. Similarly, here at home, we have another threat to grasslands here, and that's conversion of cropland, wheat, corn, and soy. And so thinking about regenerative practices of commodity crops is fine, but if we don't take into account the footprint of what it means to convert, and I think Freddie also brought that up, there's not the either credit of keeping landscapes intact for ranchers who are using beef production to keep grasslands intact, or in this case, foresters, right, who are keeping smallholder forests intact. And there's not the ding that should be in terms of the embedded carbon and the cost of converting that land. Even if you're doing regenerative production of crop commodities, there's a fundamental release of carbon from converting it from a natural habitat in the first place. So we think a lot about forest conversion in the US, but I think what this report is really highlighting is they have a whole bar contribution of conversion of grassland. And that in the US, 2.6 million acres in the Great Plains is what's being converted every year, as well as in the Northern Great Plains, which people forget it's a climate sink, but it's also a really important biodiversity store and livelihoods. And they're marginal soils and not, think of all the inputs then that have to go to facilitate getting some yield and production. So keeping it, actually in this case, livestock is really critical for keeping that landscape in grass. And then what and how to incentivize a really thin margin sector of livestock in that region in actually really climate smart approach in this case. So I think there's a lot of nuances and challenges in thinking about, but that's why the systems approach is really important. And then thinking about how to partner, as you were mentioning, with not just the public sector, but corporates are really trying to lower their footprint. For instance, on beef production, there's several large well-known brands that we have a partnership with Cargill, Walmart, and McDonald's in the Northern Great Plains to improve ranching practices, but also keep grasslands grass. And that's part of the strategy of reducing the overall footprint too. And I'll leave it at that. I have lots more, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I'll make sure we get back to you. So, Steele, coming back to you, how is Farmers Business Network? I thought of you specifically for nitrous oxide and the innovative financial tools trying to incentivize better nitrogen balance, if you will, so as to avoid the higher risk of loss of nitrous oxide. So can you talk a little bit about what you all are working on there?
Yeah, absolutely. And so while I wasn't observed, I also read the report. So
You were under the hot seat.
right, exactly. Or at least no one can deny that I didn't read it. But what jumped out to me, and I'm really appreciative of this, is that we need to do more on methane, right? We need to do more as a company. We need to focus more on that. And so that is a takeaway that I will come back a year from today and tell you all about what we're working on from that perspective. But our partnership with EDF is long focused on efficiency of production in current working lands, specifically around nitrogen use efficiency. And that coupled with a desire of mine to help get higher prices for conversion and for practice adoption led us to look at supply chain work is incredible. I think there are a lot of different programs out there and substantially more now because of the Climate Smart initiative from the USDA. But what we were really interested in is looking at the other places that touch farm business today and how could those groups, I'm thinking about financing, I'm thinking about crop insurance, I'm thinking about inputs, how could all of those groups together both help participate and then help share in the claims that could come from that, resulting in stackable incentives where you might have a premium program where you're delivering corn or soybeans. You might have a discount on an operating loan. You might have discount on biologicals at fixed end that replace synthetic fertilizers. Today, a lot of those groups are fighting for the same claim. And what we're hopeful that we can be able to do in the future is split those appropriately or have them be those claims be stackable as well so that everybody can be working on the same farm instead of fighting over it. And at the center of all that, and Freddie, I really appreciate your comments, is the grower. We have to remember that regardless of the price, there is a huge I don't know if learning curve is the right word, but changes in farms take time, and our best advocates are the growers. And if we start there and then work into what I think the solutions can be, as opposed to being only looking at a top-down approach, I think that's crucially important. And so without that, kind of at any price, a double price or triple price of that $27, you're still looking at a fairly slow and painful, I would say, marketing and changing of programs as you work to win growers' hearts and minds. So that's what I was thinking about a lot. And we'll just give a plug for innovative finance solution that we have as part of a Climate Smart Commodities program with Field to Market. And with EDF, we are working on scaling up what we would see as one of the first green bonds or green securitizations for growers who adopt EDF's End Balance program. So growers who are applying enough to maximize the efficiency of that working land, but not apply so much that they run the risk of additional denitrification or nitrogen runoff. Being able to pair that with the myriad of sustainability programs that are now live on the supply chain side, I think could be truly revolutionary.
Thank you for that. We cast a very wide net together looking at the science and economic data. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what, we got through that whole tranche of analysis and what do we need? What could we do better if we had more research or more science to inform and steer these concepts?
So first of all, as a scientist, I always want more data. Like there was, I think it's good that we have more and more research going into like estimating emissions from things and estimating emissions reductions or sequestration from practices. but anybody who works in the sector knows it's squishy. Like it's really hard to come up with a number because it's everything. It depends. It's like what you get to say in the theory. Well, it depends. People don't love that answer, but it's true. So when we were making these estimates, it was interesting how some of the sectors estimates were a little bit tighter together. I think like methane and enteric, it was somewhat tighter. Anything involving land or nitrogen application, there was huge divergence in what people estimated just what the emissions are. And to me, that says, you can always generate more and better data. And then when you also add the economics in, we looked at recent reports, but there aren't a lot of them. And it's just estimating how much does this cost. There's also so much variability there. So there's a lot of wiggle room. But everything was pointing in the same direction, that these practices improve things. So I think, that whole progress not perfect, let's get the ball moving is great. And then the other thing that we talked a lot about, which I started thinking about too, is that marginal abatement cost curves right now are based on CO2 emissions, right? It's like, what does it cost? But what if we had those kind of curves based on biodiversity loss, or you had that kind of curve on nitrate leaching, or water quality or water use, or even impacted communities or underserved communities. We need to also factor in, it's not just money and carbon, right? All of these practices have other broader impacts. And how could we develop data so we could hit multiple metrics at once? I think would be, this is just me dreaming of it, but I think that would be really important as well. So if you've got the same cost, but over here, we also could include water, or we could include marginalized communities, then that could also help drive investment for multiple areas.
Okay, thank you. Betty, I want to come back to you to talk about livestock. So you were describing some different agroforestry and animal health interventions that the Federation has new funding toward, and wonder if you could describe those so folks get a better idea of what you're doing on the ground.
Well, through partnership with USDA, we're implementing a program to address issues on farms that agroforestry operations. And what we found is we have a lot of agroforestry operations that don't realize they're agroforestry operations. So it's about addressing the tree resource or the forest resource, as well as addressing the animal aspect, whether that's small ruminants or cattle. But it's managing both sustainably. Going in, making sure that you have a healthy stand of trees that are healthy forests that was there, but not necessarily being managed. And going in and providing the technical assistance to a lot of the smaller producers that have those operations. And then doing the same for the cattle operations or the small ruminant operations, making sure that the herd health issues are being addressed. I think we can address a lot of climate issues with, I think on the smaller end, it's a lot of opportunity. When you start looking at herd health issues and looking at vaccinations being up to date, worming, all of that type of thing, even with the timber, the forest resource, simple thinning, and things like that, they're not being conducted on a lot of smaller operations. And it's a combination of a couple of things. It's the education aspect as well as market aspect. And that's why I think that this commodity markets is super important. Is that it's offering the opportunity for some markets to be introduced to some of these landowners that traditionally would not have been introduced to the landowners. So it's giving the opportunity, and the market is actually recognizing that they exist and they're players in this. So I think that so addressing that market and providing markets, and so we're going out and linking markets up, and a lot of that's through co-op development, which is one of our biggest missions. And so it's grouping farmers together with forest resources or with grazing and having access to market and communicating with the market so that they know how important it is and how they need to market that in order for those producers to be able to make the financial gains that they need. It involves, some unlikely markets and partnering with, when we start talking about forest resources, we're talking about a lot of times unmanaged forests because those are forests that are not recognized as even being something that's financially feasible. And so it's partnering with the low value forest products. We think forest products, a lot of time we're thinking dimensional lumber, 2x4s, things like that, pulp and paper. But sometimes we have to get even below the pulp and paper aspect in order to address some of the issues. And that includes maybe looking at some biomass opportunities and things like that and linking those markets with some of the producers and just making that whole connection there.
Rita, it seems like that resonates with you. Do you want to jump off from there?
Yeah, just to emphasize Freddie's point, when you look at the kind of small family forest land base in the U.S., what is really, frankly, troubling about that land base is less than 15% of those landowners have a forester, have a plan, or actually doing something actively with that land. And so to your point, when a family is struggling to figure out how to keep it in the family, how to pay the taxes, it's like, what is this land doing? And we're not really doing anything with it. So we think, okay, it's best to sell to the developer or convert, et cetera. And so on the flip of that, if you think about that, there's potential on 85% of those family lands out there. Again, if you think about the flip of that, and to your point, yeah, a lot of those landowners aren't harvesting today. If they are harvesting, they're harvesting on a very episodic basis when they have a family issue, right? When they need to pay, a big tax bill, or when, they need to send their child to school. And so how do we actually instill a more sustainable and productive model so that those forests over time are actually healthier and more sustainable and ultimately producing better carbon values as well? So there's a big opportunity on that 85%. And it's small family properties and kind of reaching down into them to really figure out what's going to work on that local basis. What are those forest practices that are going to work on that local basis? So huge opportunities there. I'll just speak a little bit to some of the work that we're trying to do. And thank you, USDA, for a climate smart commodity grant recently. But some of the work that we're trying to do is really unlock the carbon markets, unlock those voluntary carbon markets for that small landowner. How do we reach down? And, the traditional carbon markets have been markets that really, if you've got more than, less than 5,000 acres, forget it. You couldn't participate. And so what we're trying to build is a program in partnership with the Nature Conservancy. It's called the Family Forest Carbon Program. And our goal from the beginning was to reach down and say, could we actually get to a 30-acre landowner? And we found that we can do that. It's hard, and your pricing points in your report are really interesting. Like at $10 a ton, it's going to be really hard to get to those 30-acre landowners. But if we're going to get the climate mitigation value of those lands, we've got to figure that out. And it's possible. There's a lot of innovation happening right now to really enable those small landowners to retain their land and get higher productivity land in partnership with their other commodity production that they're doing. Yeah.
Dale, how are you seeing scale play into nitrogen management incentives?
Yeah, I was just thinking when you're talking about technology and how do we hit certain price points, I think that's it's a really interesting time to be working on larger scale row crop development. So what FBN has built and what we've long wanted to be able to do is provide the granularity of measurement of certain practices that are used for corn production to be able to link to major markets that already exist or are emerging in the future. And so Bill talked about the California clean fuel policy, how they are measuring and rewarding carbon reduction in those systems. Being able to take markets like that and extend it down to growers who do have a reduction in nitrogen application, for example. That granularity is now available. It's not just through FBN. There are other companies that can provide that access as well. And so the question really is, how do we make sure that those markets are aware of that, and how do we include and increase policy or extend policy well within the intent of that policy to include growers and recognize the practices that they're adopting. I think the same could be potentially true of land use change as well. So we had developed a software for the new Canada Clean Fuel policy for growers to accurately claim that this land was not converted in the past. I forget the timeline. To be able to say, we understand and appreciate there are land use change penalties. That doesn't reflect my land. Here's the proof that can happen. It's also going to be, a question of whether that allows for new lands to be brought in and have them be economically viable, which I think is in line with what you've talked about for this program. And so having that granularity, clean fuel policy in the new Inflation Reduction Act, and even they're talking about in the SEC, to be able to have granularity that includes growers, that allows them to benefit from adoption of practices is, I see as the number one issue to be able to scale substantial farm practice improvement and to emission reduction.
I'm going to switch it up in a little bit and ask you for a one sentence answer, and then we're going to see if anyone from the audience has questions. If you need 2 sentences, that's okay.
Don't give us room.
That was your one sentence.
Yeah, I know, I'm done. I got plenty of time on the train.
Okay, so we're talking about 2030 vision. So in the next 7-8 years, by 2030, in a sentence-ish, where do you see ag and forestry having the most climate impact by 2030? Be brave enough to start.
In the United States or globally? States. We go back to the produce, protect, and restore. U.S. cynical. U.S. major agricultural producer needs to stay that way in a manner that stops any type of extensification, reduces the GHG intensity of what's being produced, and restore some of what we've lost. That's the picture. A bit of what we saw.
Durable markets with high incentivization. That's it.
Enabling access and implementation on small family land.
And understanding of environmental benefits that the natural resources that's own offer.
I think we need the systems framing to realign policy levers, not just across the farm bill, but across child nutrition and consumption, drivers, as well as environmental regulation and incentives for climate and environmental outcomes, and in addition to the equity issues. I just think right now the policies are working at cross purposes, and I think we need to realign with common values on what we want for healthy people, healthy communities, and healthy planet, and then think about radically changing the status quo and how we do agriculture now. I think, and I'll just add, the previous session you guys hosted was a global report launch. Sorry, on exponential roadmap. We cannot do incremental change, so we need to radically rethink and realign our policy levers accordingly for US ag. Long sentence.
I would like to think that we collect data and we make data-driven choices. That I think we have a lot of the information. We just need to synthesize it and use it.
Thank you. Great answers. How are we doing on time? Thank you. Okay. Question? I would like to say.
Play the game.
Yeah, Bill.
Bill, what's your sentence?
My sentence. I think it really comes down to that I really liked Steele's response, but it's that the regenerative agriculture becomes conventional agriculture. So the reimagination of what conventional agriculture. When we're successful, it means that it's sort of the expectation. This is what my neighbors do. This is what farmers up the road do. This is just the way we farm.
My question to you, to the whole panel, I think reading the report is, if we see how important this avoided conversion is, we listen to Freddie and Rita about how important it is to provide small family forests and forest farms, ranchers, a stake in not converting their land, not selling it for development, not selling it for additional row crops. How do we use things like the carbon markets in there, where it's all about additionality? So do we need a two-tier pathway? Wondering if anybody has any thoughts on that one, including you.
I'll
Go for it, Freddie.
I think that as and I think one of the things I probably could have added to the 2030 is lowering the cost to participate in a lot of these. And I think that's something now that's really, I mean, when you see opportunity, I think that's where, and as we do that, then we allow for opportunities for the smaller, for more of the benefits to go to the landowners. And I think that's something that we really would really help and that we should focus on.
Yeah, I wanted to add a plug around putting carrots and sticks on what it means to have drive land use change. So the Science Based Targets Initiative next week will be launching the new forest land use and ag protocols to incorporate that piece of the component for how companies set their SBTI, their GHG reduction targets, again, based on the best science globally on what their contribution should be, what's a credible reduction target for company X based on their contribution to the economic global GDP, et cetera. And so forest land use and ag has not been really incorporated before, and this new protocol being launched will add that in. So thinking about where and how embedded carbon is, and for instance, the majority of commodities driving the Great Plains conversion go into biofuels and animal feed. 55% of the wheat that's driving conversion is exported. So how to ensure that those commodities incorporate that land use change is the ding that carbon should be counted against that production of the commodities that those feeds go into. On the other side, I think, Freddie, the forest is mirrored on the land use change for agricultural production on ranching. I bet you could speak to the ranching piece too. A lot of the ranching producers do not get a credit, if you will, or some sort of support for maintaining their landscapes, which are pretty marginal soils and lands in ranching. And so they're dinged because they're producing beef and sort of are shunned by the world because beef is a terrible climate commodity. So I think thinking of how and what to provide incentives for avoided conversion in grasslands, that's the kind of project we're doing with corporates, but thinking of blended finance, there's all sorts of ways of thinking about how and what's a fair price and how they should, and a lot of them are smallholders who can't access and don't know how to get access to carbon markets. And grasslands data, to your piece, I'll add, there's such a dearth of data on grassland contributions. There's so much more on forests, and we know grasslands don't contribute as much as forests. But you think of an inverted root system in grasslands, all of what you see that's stored is not in the upper biomass, like the way it is in trees. It's all below ground. And so we need much better data to really value and attribute grassland storage, carbon storage.
I think the only thing I would add is, I think our experience with working with family landowners through like a carbon program is, once we get a landowner on a path to understanding the value of their land and figuring out a way to at least pay the taxes, right? Like that's what carbon markets really are helping do. It's like, you can pay the taxes at least. That really helps with the conversion factor, right? It really helps with, the landowner being able to retain that. And then I think one of the key questions for USDA and the community around all the benefits in the IRA is, how do we use incentives programs like ASAP and LWCF and all of those great programs that help with avoided loss of forest or ag land? How do those work in concert with market-based programs, right? How do we think about the portfolio of incentives that might be a better fit using a farm bill program to deal with conversion, and then it might be a better fit to utilize the market to deal with the restoration and improved forest management. So like, how do we fit all of those together is going to be a really key question moving forward. So we can unlock all of this financing because we know the government dollars are great. It's not going to be enough to get at the 560 million metric tons a year. So how do we mix all of this together is going to be really critical piece.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So as we move into a world where you're kind of expand the number of landowners, smaller scale landowners who are participating in programs that are both public and private, are there important sort of data security, data privacy, data as an asset issues? I'd be really curious to hear if people are encountering that discussion.
So the question was about data security, data management, what Bill touched on about personally identifiable information when we're talking about moving traceability through in order to get at incentives.
Yeah. No, Fred, if you want to talk about that, I'm happy to just speak quickly to how we. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very real question, especially in the context of the government programs. I think for the work that we're doing through the Family Forest Carbon Program, we're the landowners sign up for a contract with us, and they commit to allowing us to do monitoring on their property, et cetera. And I think a lot of cases, because the work that we're doing, it's very locally based, right? So we're working with local foresters, local nonprofits. It's a much more comfortable space for landowners. And then we commit to privacy on their information, right? We're aggregating that information in the marketplace. So we're doing all we can to, protect that information and only use it in the context of an aggregated model across the landscape to sell carbon credits, if that helps you. But it's a really important issue. And so far, I think we've found, landowners are more comfortable when you've got that local community engagement with them and those commitments in place.
And I can speak on it from a organization or a community-based organization standpoint. Is we work in the partnerships work well because we work on behalf of those landowners and with that information. So we're really protective of that personal information because we're, to your point, we're dealing with a very vulnerable population when we start talking about the underserved landowners. And then there's that trust issue that we battle daily from past practices and things. And so, I think the key, and one of the things that I'm seeing is a lot of this communications going through, and emphasis has been put on community-based and working with community-based organizations. And most community-based organizations I'm familiar with really take ownership in that information. And I think that's one of the ways that these landowners' information is being protected, and as well as their rights.
Has that come up with you? I'm thinking about different ways of being able to use GIS to kind of know where you're talking about without being more specific about the actual farm.
Yeah. So data privacy comes up in every single farmer meeting, every single day. It's a huge issue. And in part, some of the anxiety is because there's not a clarity on how the data is being used or what data is useful for. And so we frequently get questions about who we are selling data to, which is no one ever. And we also have anxiety about China as well. People are saying, is this going to China? There is a lot of technology that can protect, land boundaries, personal identifiable information. In fact, we're working on a program right now where we are we're passing information to a group to do environmental calculations, and we've been able to figure out how to fuzz field boundaries without degradation to the modeling, which has substantially improved protection of our growers and quite frankly that organization as well, so that they don't have to worry about being able to defend or show or have the same level of security that our organization does. But I think the best approach is to be utterly transparent about where the data goes, what it's being used for, and how it's being protected, and be prepared if you're going to be in the space to have that conversation always.
Yep. Other questions?
Yeah, I'm kind of new to this space, and I'm wondering why you mentioned a little bit why they're concerned about privacy, but what's the fear of having it be known that it's your farm?
So it's not only the farm, but there's two primary concerns. One, farm is a small business, and the data that's being shared with us is as close to their intellectual property as possible. So nitrogen application rates, what part of the field, what yields they're getting. All of that information could be used to trade against them. If your trading partners know more about or can guess, how much you have in the bin left over to sell, they may not give you as good rates, and that's a real concern. The other component is that there has long been a kind of a perception that data is intrinsically valuable based on what Google has done, essentially, that this information is being used to market to them, or it's being sold to sell in other products. And farm data, honestly, I don't know a lot of groups that have any model in selling information besides to selling to the private finance institutions or insurance groups. But data as a standalone ag tech model is not very profitable or interesting. What we use data for is to give value back to growers, help them take what is a tremendous amount of information and give it to them in actionable ways. Like, for example, how do your crop protection prices compare regionally and nationally, and does that allow you to negotiate for better rates? That's where the real value of farm data comes from, but it's often not appreciated that that's how it happens.
And I would say from a forestry standpoint, it would lend to, because you've got volumes and species and things in that data, and that could possibly lead to predatory purchasing habits and things like promoting that.
Yeah. The other concern is always increased regulation. So how is my information going to be?
Yeah, and I think there's this historic sort of distrust between the farm community and the environmental community. I think that's also underpinned some of it. That farmers sort of view that they're getting blamed for a lot of things, and so they're a little less reluctant, a little more reluctant to share data and information, especially on the environmental side.
Yeah.
This is even for animal health, and I think a real ID for animal, looking at health and safety issues. There's a lot of pushback on track and trace systems for disease outbreaks and things like that.
But can I mention on the converse, what's interesting now is with smart farms and smart tractors and things, you can now pay $100 a year for a private company. You send them data, they have satellite data of your farm, and I don't know the details, and it depends. But then they basically send you a prescription how to do your variable rate technology. They're like, you put it into your tractor, and then you put this much nitrogen here and there. So there is now, I don't know, the Googleification of farming or whatever. So farmers are uploading, and then they can also aggregate regional data from farmers they have to figure out the best crop, the best variety, how to plant, how much to plant, when to plant. So there is big data going into some of the smart farming, but there's still that sort of discomfort with the farmers. I mean, in that case, you're paying to do it, but it's also like having an Alexa, right? I'm just saying, so there is the data privacy, but farmers are also getting into the same sort of data exchange for value as we are in other aspects of our lives.
Yeah, so a lot of this is around data that relate to farm level, personal information, how much applications you made, et cetera. But at least for quite a few folks in this room, like an environmental perspective, there's actually a growing amount of publicly available data, at least to understand trends. It's not going to tell you what you did with your tract of land, but we can actually now know where trees have been cut, where grasslands have been converted, where croplands have expanded even by crop. Now, it won't say Jane Smith's farm, right? We're not, that data truly is kind of protected. But the biophysical land carbon land use change now is available. So, for instance, our land and carbon lab we have at WRI, which is funded by Baby's Earth Fund, we launched earlier this year, first ever global data on crops, 30-meter resolution for the entire planet for the past 20 years, working with the University of Maryland. So imagine 30-meter resolution, right, for the entire planet. And that's fascinating, as you can see, because you can actually see when some farmers in Nebraska up through North Dakota decided to get out of the conservation reserve program, which you presume, and started opening up that grassland, because you see it go from grass to crop. And now we know, and Matt Hansen and his team now can know is it soy or maize, right? We've done the same in Brazil. We know soy versus maize in Brazil. And now we're working with Sentinel at 10-meter resolution. Matt just showed me 2 weeks ago in China, you can see the rows of the crops in the northeastern parts of China. So we did have an entire planet. So that type of data is out there, which is helpful for just understanding general trends. And what we're doing is we're layering carbon data on that as well at a 30-meter resolution. So you can actually start getting a sense of what's happening year in, year out on the data. On the croplands, we do it a 4-year average because in some parts of the planet, you've got fallow periods, et cetera. But the one fascinating thing I found, just to kind of drive home the point that we have a produce and protect challenge before us globally, is that, I'd like to say, what Matt Hansen and his team found was that for the past 8,000 years, since the end of the last ice age, it took 8,000 years to convert 1.1 billion hectares of nature into cropland. In the past 20 years, we expanded that by another 10%. Right? Now, the majority of that was in Latin America and Africa. Think of the Congo Basin and Reverse Sea, that whole band, massive amounts of loss of grasslands, wetlands, and some forest into cropland for a growing population. You can't blame them, right? U.S. relatively stable, some changes on the margin, and some cropland going to something else. China, massive loss of cropland to urban areas. And you go on our site and you can see basically China, northeastern China in the year 2000. Lots of the color's orange for cropland, right? And I think urban is blue. And you switch the slider to 2020, all that cropland's gone. It's urban development. Demand didn't change. So it's an export of the production to the global south. So these land use changes, and a lot of today's comes with the U.S. That's why I said it's important for the United States to stay a major producer of the world's food. Just do it more sustainably, more low carbon. If the U.S. backs out of this, we haven't solved the problem. You may make the numbers on certain things look better in the U.S., but you have not solved the global problem. In fact, you probably made it worse because yields elsewhere are going to be less than they are here. That's why I'm a big advocate that we got to get the produce right, and let's not lose that thought here in terms of what we're doing here. Because I think it's a global challenge we're facing. And history has been, we do something here and then, you export your problem somewhere else. We're running out of somewhere else, right? And so that's why these issues here, what we do today with the bill and the policies that have been placed have implications not only for here, will have knock-on effects of what happens in the rest of the planet. So I just want to drive home the point of the importance of this discussion.
Thank you. That's, I think, a good place to leave it. Thank you all very much. I'll thank our panelists.